If you are currently leveling up your Django skills with this tutorial is part of a free YouTube playlist. The link to the whole playlist is in the video description. Now, if you love this tutorial and playlist, then you might also like to check out the whole course, Django Database ORM Mastery on Udemy. The link to the course, which should provide the best price, can be found in the video description. We're now ready to migrate our Django models over to our test database. Quickly taking a look at this scribble. So we have already now completed the task of building our container, waiting for the container to start, checking the container with a health check. So now we can go ahead and migrate our Django models. Right, so for this, let's get back into the fixtures. And we're going to now need to think about how we're going to access the database to perform the actual migration. When building tests or trying to interact with the Django database from our testing environment, we need to remember that by default, we don't have access to the database. Only if we explicitly request database access will we be allowed. In order for us to gain access, reading through the Pytest Django documentation, we're told here that we potentially need to utilize the Django DB blocker, which is an object that will allow specific code paths to have access to the database. Now we're going to need that specific code path into the database so that we can perform the migration. Now you can see we are provided an example here and we just simply need to follow that. So we need to bring in Django DB blocker, and then with Django DB blocker unblock function, we can then go ahead and modify the database, i.e. run our migrations. Back into our fixture then, let's go ahead and pass in the Django DB blocker. And now let's build a try block. So try, and then following the guide in the Pytest Django documentation. So with Django DB blocker, we then utilize the unblock method. And then we can go ahead and I'm adding these prints here so that we can follow the progress of our setup. Should there be any issues, we can start to see where potentially the issues might be. So that's the only reason why I'm using prints here for that. And you can remove them or not include them. Right, so now we need to actually migrate our Django models over to the test database. So Django's call command function allows us to programmatically call command allows us to programmatically run any Django management command from our code. So we will need to, from django.core.management, import the call command. So we have our call command, and let's go ahead and define what it is we want to run. Well, what we're going to do here is run a custom migration. So we're going to build a custom migration management command to run specifically for migrating our Django models to the test database. So we're going to call that command test migrate. You can call it whatever you like, but that's the name of the command that we're going to build. And we are going to still pass in the app label equals inventory. Now I specifically selected app label here, which is the parameter which specifies which Django app the command should target. So we're just going to migrate, in this case, the inventory app migration files. Now this approach will only work for the inventory app. If we start to build multiple apps, we would need to refactor this code and consider how we could create a little bit more dynamic code to ensure that we can specify multiple apps before running the migration. But for now, as an example, let's go with this code. Now, please take into consideration, sometimes I show you things, I do things in a certain way, not to replicate how you might actually build your application, but to try and expand our knowledge of Django and features. So sometimes I might not take a natural path to meet our goal, but I try to ensure that we add as much information in as I can think of that can be relevant to a particular step or stage in our project to hopefully expand your knowledge of Django and Django ORM. So if you remember, we did create a custom command previously, and that was an override of, where are we? So in the inventory management commands, we provided some additional requirements to running the built-in migrate command. If you remember, now when we run Django migrate, we have to supply the app label and the database. And that is because we are running a custom router setup, and I want to make sure that in order for that to work correctly, we want to always supply that information when we migrate. Now that isn't necessarily going to be suitable for our current setup, so we're going to build this new custom management command. So let's stop talking about it and let's actually get this done. So in commands, new file, remember it's going to be called test migrate. You see the name of the command and the name of this module here is going to be the same. So test migrate, there we go. Right, so for this, what we can do is go into the migrate command, the existing migrate command, and we can simply just copy it across. And we just need to make a few changes here. We don't need to import sys anymore. Okay, so we've got command error. Okay, so raise command error. We have command as migrate command, so we can extend the migrate command or extend from the migrate command that's built into Django, adding some additional functionality. And we're not going to be utilizing if database. Okay, so that's pretty much the changes that we're going to make there. So now when we run the test migrate custom command, that's going to call this migrate command, which is the migrate command plus some additional functionality. And that should then migrate the Django models from the inventory app over to the test database. Right, so I think we're ready to try this out. Let's finish this off with a finally, and let's just put a placeholder in there so the code will run. Now we need to remember where we are in the terminal, so we need to cd into our project, and then we can go ahead and run Pytest, and we should have a similar issue that we had previously. So we're told here that fetch and server API version, connection aborted. Okay, so if you receive this error, connection, this is a Docker exception, error while fetching server API. So that's just telling me that it's not finding Docker on my system, which is probably telling me that Docker actually isn't running. So it's probably a good idea to make sure that Docker has started. And let's try this again. So this time we should receive a different error. We should connect, but we potentially have an error related to the database. Yes, so because we left some print statements in our code, you can see the progress. So the health check has passed, so the container we would suggest has been correctly created, and Postgres is ready. Postgres is ready, and then you can see we've tried to run the migration. And at that point, potentially we have now had the error that we've been receiving the last couple of times we've run Pytest. And that's the fact that our test environment cannot find any database settings. So we're told here, improperly configured, please supply the engine value. So as soon as I see that, I know it's related to our Django settings setup and the fact that our testing environment cannot find any valid database settings to actually connect to a database. Now, the reason why this is happening is because we have our custom router setup. Remember, we have this default setup for the built-in apps, which will migrate the Django built-in apps to the Django DB database settings, which is a SQL-like database that is created when we migrate any of these apps. And we have the inventory router, which will then migrate based upon the inventory DB settings in our Django settings to the inventory database, which is our Postgres database. Now, what's happening here is our testing environment is not providing anything that's being captured here, either in the default router or the inventory router. So what's happening, if we go back into our core settings, is that it's then trying to work through this settings, find these settings. It can't find that, or it doesn't make a match in our router setup. It doesn't make a match here in our Django DB, so then it's reverting back to the default. And that is why we then see the engine value check is not supplied, because we don't actually have anything set here in the default, which is the default for our testing environment. Now, needless to say, like many things here in Django, there are different approaches. There is a Django documentation approach to potentially defining your testing database within an existing setup here in your database configuration. We're going to follow a slightly different approach. So what we're going to do is we're going to modularize our settings and have separate settings defined for production, for when we actually deploy our application onto our live server, settings for development, and then settings for testing. So let's just follow a very simple approach to modularize our settings. So what we're going to do, let me just see if I can zoom in a bit so we can see this. Right, so inside of our Django inventory, we have our core module, which has the settings file. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call that settings, so folder. And then I'm going to place these settings inside of that folder. And then I'm going to rename this to core. And that's going to be the default settings. So this can be inherited by other settings or imported from other settings. So the idea is that we have this core setting file, which will have generic settings that we will use for both production, development, and tests. And then we go ahead and create some separate files and modules for our development and testing environment. And that just will allow us to create or have different settings for different environments. Different setups, of course, will be required for different environments. So let's go back into the core, and what we're going to do here, let's just lift off the databases from the core. I'm going to go into development, and I'm just going to put that back, and the development database is going to be utilizing this setup. Okay, so I need to import OS, and then in addition to that, just from .base, that's the base setting, let's import all those settings. So we're just going to extend from base and add the database settings, which means we can now go back into our core. Apologies, I don't want to call this, oh, I can call it core, let's call it core. I was going to call it base, but let's just call it core. I can now go back into my core settings and remove that. So we'll find that that's only going to be now available in the development. So this is database settings specifically for development. So now let's change the test. So this time we're going to, let's remove the default and Django DB, and then let's just call this default. I then need to change the environment variable names. So I'm just going to add the word test to the end of them. And then what I can now do is go into the environment file. And again, we're just using this file as a way of centralizing all of the environment variables that we want to potentially set up for this project. Again, this is just hopefully a simplistic way at this point. We're not necessarily trying to set this up for production or thinking about this in any more depth other than we just want to centralize some of our settings for our project, which will make it easier for us to manage them later on when we start to think about deployment. So what we're going to need to do here is just copy and paste the existing Postgres setup. Let's add the configuration for our test database. It should be, I think, the same. Actually, I think we're using a different port. Let's just double check. So if you go into our tests and go to our fixture, let's just double check the utilities and test database. If you remember our settings here, we did specify 5433 for our test container. Remember, we can't use the same port for multiple Postgres databases we may be running. So we're going to need to change that port to 5.4 in the environment variables. Just change that to 5433. Right. So with that done, we now have the settings for our test database. So that's being matched now over to the test settings. We might like to, no, I think we're good there. That's pretty much all we need to do there. So let's remove that, and that's finished. So we have our development database now in our core and our fixtures. Right, so what we're going to need to do is make a few changes in our project, because we have now changed the default location of our settings in our project. So let's go into manage.py and make sure we define them here. So we core into settings, and then this is going to be development. So we're working in development at the moment. So we're going to make sure that whenever we run this project, it's going to use the development settings, which is obviously going to inherit all the core settings. So we need to make sure that that works correctly. So let's just make sure we're in the right directory and run the run server. And you can see here that we do still have a problem. So in settings, development, py, line 3, module not found, no module name, core settings. Right. So Django, core, settings, development. Oh, because I've named it base. In my mind, it was going to be called base. Okay, so from core, apologies. So let's try that again. So this time you can see that we are now using in our project the core settings development for our Django project. So now we need to make sure that the test settings are correctly defined. So let's go back into our test folder and look for the Pytest INI. And there you remember we actually defined the settings that we're going to be utilizing. So this is going to be for now test. I think it's called test. Yep, core development and test. So we're now going to use the test settings, which obviously defines the test database for our test environment. Now that by default is going to look for default, which is then going to utilize the settings, which is then going to solve the problem we had previously. So let's run Pytest now. Actually, let's close the server first and then run Pytest. That's my stomach. Right, so Django find project equals false. Okay, so there's a problem here. It says Pytest Django found a Django project, blah, blah, blah. It contains manage.py and added it to the Python path. But you can see that we didn't actually run any tests. So no module named core settings base, because we had the same problem as before. I've accidentally called this base and not core. I should have just called it base, shouldn't I? Okay, so I've changed the import in test.py. Apologies for this. So let's run Pytest now, and you can see it looks like it has successfully identified the settings. We're waiting for the test database to start. It looks like that has happened absolutely fine, and we've run all of our tests, and there are now no issues. So that is indicating the fact that the migrations were actually successful. So let's take a look. If we go back into Docker, let's move into our test database. Let's take a look. Let's go into the command prompt and log into our database, so PSQL. And then we're going to need a U for user, Postgres, and then we can define a database inventory. Okay, so now we can run a DT, sorry. And then that will then show us the fact that all of these tables have been migrated and they currently reside in the inventory schema, except of course the Django migrations table, which is in the inventory management schema. So it looks like our test database is now ready for us to run test. Now before we do that, just head back over to the fixtures. There's one last task we can add here. So in the Pytest fixture, the yield statement is used to manage the setup and tear down activities. So what we can do here is we have a setup. So in try block, we have a setup, which is of course running our migrations. After that migration is complete, the tests will start running. And what we can then do is yield. yield. Okay, so what's going to happen here is that this try block essentially will stop until the tests have all been completed. And then once the tests have been completed, we can then think about teardown. So after the test code completes, the fixture resumes the yield statement, and then the finally block runs. Typically in here, like I said, we use this to clean up resources. So what we can do here, we need to do a little bit of cleaning up. So let's grab our container. Remember, we are in this function, we are passing back the container for us to perform additional operations on the container. So we can now access the container because of that. And then we can go ahead and maybe stop the container, and then we can remove the container. So that will be our teardown code, stopping and removing the test database. So whereas before when we run the test database lingers after the test, let's just see this in action. So we run Pytest once again. We now have this issue, and I wasn't expecting. I think we've got an issue here with the terminal. So let's just restart the terminal. Let's cd back into our project. Let's run Pytest again. Oh, we do have a problem. Okay, so no module named core.settings. Now, I'm not too sure what happened there. Maybe I accidentally deleted something, but in my Pytest INI, I just need to add the word test again to correctly identify the settings that we're using. I'm not too sure why that happened. Let's run Pytest again. So this time we're now waiting for Postgres to initiate. Our test should run, but of course this time we now have the cleanup code, and you can see that the container has been removed. And you can actively see that, of course. If we run Pytest, you can see the test database is being prepared. The test will run, and then this will obviously be removed after the tests have finished. Now, don't forget, if you're running this and you don't have images already downloaded, it is going to take maybe a little bit longer initially, and that might require you also to consider better defining the settings in the utility file that we created. Remember, we have defined settings for intervals, timeouts, retries, etc. And it might be that you have a very slow internet connection to download the image initially, and then you would trigger maybe the 60-second timeout that we added here, for example, or potentially might trigger the error based upon the parameters that we've set up here for the health check. So do be careful of that initially, but once you've got the image in place, that shouldn't be the case with the current setup, but that's something for you to consider. And there we go. So our initial goal was to build a Postgres container utilizing Docker API and create some sort of facility to check the container and Postgres has started. We used Docker API before then migrating our Django models over to the test database. The tests have now run, and we've learned how to then roll back and tidy up any resources that we created through this process.